Bright morning stars are rising. Bright morning stars are rising. Day is a-breaking in my soul.
Appalachia is that somewhat mythical region with no known boundaries. If such an area exists in terms of geography, such a domain as has shaped the lives of men and women from pioneer days to the present, and given them an independence and an outlook and a vision such is often attributed to them, I trust to be understood for imagining the heart of it to be in the hills of eastern Kentucky, where I have lived and feel at home, and where I have exercised as much freedom and peace as the world allows.
Well, I know what he said at first. It was not the people, it was the trees. He said that he was, you know, he has many, many interests, and writing's one of them. But he was interested in the flora and fauna of the region.
I couldn't possibly explain it. We're all different. We have to feel it ourselves. But what you're seeing here was not here then. None of these houses you're seeing. This road was not here. This was a quiet place. All you heard were the birds. And and I'd go a week or two and never see anybody.
Later on, by staying on, he became interested in the human culture of the place.
And I began to go about once a week down and walk down the mouth of the creek, give my mail, meet people. I always went to church on once a month, and somebody would always take me home with them to have Sunday dinner. And I got to, eventually I knew several fellows. They called us the Lit Car Gang. There were 4 of us. And we'd go places on Sunday. We'd visit cemeteries and interesting places around in the area, walking. And eventually, I was 50 years old, and finally they got a road a car could pass over. I have gone out to the roads that go up and down in smooth white lines, stony sand hard. I have seen distances shortened between 2 points, the hills pushed back and bridges thrust across the shallow river's span. To the broad highways and back again I have come, to the creekbed roads and narrow winding trails worn into ruts by hoofs and steady feet. I have come back to the long way around, the far between, the slow arrival. Here is my pleasure most, where I have lived and called my home. Oh, do not wander far from the roof tree and the hill-gathered earth. Go not upon these wayfarers measured with a line drawn hard and white from birth to death. Oh, quiet and slow is peace, and curved with space, brought back again to this warm homing place. This is where I had my swing, my hammock. Nearly every Sunday in good weather, I was out here in that hammock. And then I got to know the stampers down the foot of the creek, and eventually I was going to stock sales every Saturday with my neighbor. He'd blow his horn over there once we had a road. I'd go with him. So it was always people.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Mr. Steele.
To live to be 90 years old means that you've just about outlived everybody. All your neighbors, your classmates for the most part. And nowadays I'm attending funerals for my students. I had a very happy childhood. Looking back on it, I thought everybody did. There were 10 of us, but I'm counting a little half-brother. There were 5 girls first, and then 5 boys, and I'm the oldest boy, and I'm the surviving member of the family. I don't recall our playing together, and I was sort of I think a little lonely in a way. I think so. I was always doing things myself. Even from the beginning, I liked to plant things. Now, I never thought to be a farmer or anything like that, but I wanted to grow things. It's from my first memory, I had a little garden, and I was growing things, and that I continued. I planted all these trees. They're usually maybe a foot or 2 in height at the time. So when I came here, this was whole ground was barren, and so I started planting right away. That was some 50 years ago.
Well, that's one of the things the writer has to be an absorber. You know, Whitman said, I was simmering, 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 and Emerson brought me to a boil. That is, he was just taking in all of this American experience, you see, and then something touched him off. Well, Steele had been doing that for years and years and years. And the life that he knew here, while it was different in detail, was fundamentally the same kind of life that he grew up in. His father was a veterinarian. They had a farm, and he lived that rural life down there in Alabama.
But there was something important in this house was that we had 3 books, not counting the Bible. One was The Anatomy of the Horse, which was a little above me. And another was a book called The Palaces of Sin, or The Devil in Society. And I learned about, you know, this terrible stuff called gin. I knew about whiskey and all, but I didn't know about gin. And people playing cards, which was, of course, a very terrible thing to do. Then another book, the main one, a book called Cyclopdia of Universal Knowledge, which had a little of everything. A capsule history of every nation of the day. Poetry, Shakespeare, and others, and I memorized the poems. And I think that's where I got started with poetry. Nobody related to me ever wrote anything as far as I know. Not even letters much. I love that book. I just read it and read it. But I think that was the most influential book in my life. There have been others. And how could I possibly go to school or college? But this time, nobody was able to send me to school, pay for it. And I had $60, and off I went to school at Lincoln Memorial. You could work there and pay your way. And I had a chance to make up for all that reading I didn't do. I read every chance I had. I was so happy. I enjoyed being in college. And here was this big library at Lincoln Memorial. And I became the janitor. And at night, I would lock the door at 9 o'clock, sweep the floor, rub up the tables, empty the wastebaskets, and it belonged to me until morning. And some nights, I'd get so sleepy that I wouldn't go to the dormitory. I would sleep in the magazine room on piles of newspapers. I did that many times. It was a great feast. And there I got acquainted with Atlantic Monthly. In some way, I knew then it was, along with Harper's, the most prestigious literary publication being available. And I decided I wanted to write for it. And I never changed my mind about it. It never occurred to me that I wouldn't. Well, received a master's degree from Vanderbilt, and there again, it was June 1931, right in the middle of the Depression. There was no work or jobs anywhere, but all of a sudden, here was this scholarship, full scholarship, fellowship rather, to the University of Illinois, a library school. I never thought to be a librarian. It never occurred to me, but it was something to do. So I went, and we received the degree in 1 year. On the way back home, I stopped in Nashville and looked up Don West. He invited me to come to Hindman, Knott County, never heard of it.
Well, the school itself was constantly looking for staff to come in and work basically for almost nothing because they didn't have a lot of money. It was basically subsistence. And he and Don West, who was a mountain activist and so forth, came into Knott County to have a summer program of scouts and baseball and so forth, a recreation program.
And that's how I got acquainted with Selma School. That was 1931. And as it happened, the librarian resigned. And the ultimate job, it was just a job. They couldn't pay the teachers, but a number of them didn't require pay. Most were women, mostly graduates from Wellesley, and the others were from time to time, Bryn Mawr and Vassar, highly motivated. But the rest of them, they couldn't pay us, but they did feed us and a place to stay.
He said he didn't have anything, he didn't have any place to go. And as he said many times, when he came here, he felt he'd come home. I mean, he just felt from the very beginning when he came here, he was where he belonged.
But it wasn't, I felt quite enough to just sit there working day by day. So I began to, as my own project, I got permission to begin to carry books.
There was just scattered throughout the county dozens of one-room schools. And so he used to take boxes of books. I've been all over this county with him, and he'll say, yeah, I used to walk from Hyman to here, and then I might sometimes rent a pony or a little old horse for a day for 25 cents, and then I'd go over the mountain and deliver these books. But he'd start with a box of books, and he'd take those to one school, okay? And then he'd have another box. He'd come in, he'd replace those, and then he would take that box to the next school. He just had this compelling need to get books into the hands of children. I mean, that's something that is part of his being. I mean, today is as important to him as it was then.
How many of you know about Jack and the Beanstalk? Everybody knows about Jack and the Beanstalk. It's a tale that's been told for many years. An oral story. It started off being told, word of mouth, one person to another, long before it was ever in print. And any person who told it used their own language and their own words, and so it was never quite the same. So there I wrote this as if Jack lived on my creek, on Wolfpen Creek, here in Knott County, in this very county. Jack and the Wonder Beans. Way back yonder, there was a widow woman and her son Jack, and they was poor as Job's turkey. And the way some tell it, their home seat was here on Wolfpen Creek, or roundabout.
I think his power as a storyteller is a great gift to children, and especially to children in the region. And so I think he nourishes kids both as readers and as possible writers, at the same time strengthening the sense of their value, where they are and who they are. And I think it must nourish him too, because he's continued to have children in his life, and to reach, through the generations that way.
I know you don't have on shoes. Who is that? Look, who is that? Blow him kisses. Pappy, we're coming out there.
He loves children. If you've ever seen him with children, it's magical, the way he interacts with children. As Jacob reacts when he comes in, I reacted the same way. I knew that when he come, he would bring something new to tell me. And he always brought me something, whether it was something as small as an apple or an orange or a new doll. Sometimes there were trips to the grocery store for that doll just to buy diapers and baby food. The worst thing I remember happening was the death of my father. I was 5 years old. He was a coal miner, and he had black lung. It was a very tragic death, and that is the point where I believe that Mr. Steele stepped in and took over. He was there for me not only as emotional support, but he was there as a great entity, as the big shoulders to just pick me up and take me on, and that's something that I really remember.
I think he's still a little kid at heart himself, and that's one of the reasons why he's so simpatico with them.
I feel like he always has a mission in his life. It's been to try to make life a little bit better for children. And I think he's written as much for them in his writings, his Jack and the Wonder Beans, his Rhymes and Riddles, and Gee Haw Whimmy Diddles, and Sporty Creek, and those sort of things are, wanting to share with children.
Remember, I'd been on the road and away from my home, and I suddenly was in a place where I felt needed in a way, and what I was doing meant something to somebody, and I just wanted to live there. I knew I'd found a home. It was going to be hard to leave. He drank the bright air into his throat and cast a glance across the shadowed thrust of hills. And he knew that of all men who slept, who waked suddenly, he least of all could name this thing that held him here. He least could put the sound upon his tongue and build the spoken words that all might know, might speak themselves, might write in flowing script for those who come upon this place in curious search, knowing this land for what it is. But there are those who learn what is told here by convolutions of earth, by time, by winds, the water's wearings and minute shapings of man. They have struck pages with the large print of knowledge, the thing laid open, the hills translated. He least can know of this. He can but stand a stranger on familiar slopes and drink the restless air, knowing that beneath his feet, beneath his probing eyes, a river of earth flows down the strident centuries. Hills are but waves cast up to fall again, to rise still further down the years. Men are held here within a mighty tide swept onward toward a final sea. So I worked there 3 years without any pay and with nothing. And I began to write things then. I'd make a few bucks. I sent them to Atlantic, and eventually they took a poem. And I have all those poems I wrote in those days were published somewhere. Yale Review, Virginia Quarter Review, Sewanee Review. Eventually, Atlantic, they took 10 short stories and 3 poems. It didn't mean that everything I wrote turned up in those publications, but I could always step down. They got published somewhere, someplace or other. And I began to have a little income, wasn't much, ever. In those days, and perhaps now, editors read these magazines. They're looking for authors, promising writers. And I had letters from several publishers asking me for a novel, however. And eventually Viking suggested I collect my poems into a volume, which I did. And they brought it out as Hounds on the Mountain. It was well reviewed everywhere. I remember the day I got to 10 copies. I don't have depressions. I don't get it. I don't have things like that that I think other people have. But I came as near to it. I think after every book of mine's published, I have a little feeling of let down. Some people call it postpartum. anyway, something or other. This time I felt like I was totally exposed to the world, you know, all these poems. Then they asked me pretty soon if I was writing a novel. I hadn't told anybody. I sent him the beginning of River of Earth, first section, and the last section. There was nothing in between, and they sent a contract. I took a leave of absence for a year to finish the novel River of Earth, and I moved back 9 miles over a wagon road and up a mile up a creek bed to an old log house called the Hamburger Log House, which had been there since 1836, a very old house, and 31 acres connected with it. A very isolated place.
When he first came up to the place, he looked at it and he said this was the place, without his knowing it, that he'd always been looking for. There's some kind of mystical thing happened there, I guess. I thought I would just be here until the book was finished. But I knew then I probably would never leave. Not readily, anyway.
Well, I think in a way River of Earth is the classic treatment in a novel of a time in Appalachia that's gone, and it's, you know, there is, I don't think, any comparable work. And it portrays something that I guess still goes on today, which is the boom and bust of the coal fields.
These miners were people who used to farm, virtually all of them, at one time or another had a little patch of land somewhere. And they didn't move to the mines thinking they would live there forever. They were just going to make some money and they'd go back. So that was a common intention of almost everybody. And people around here living here now left this country years ago, right after the war or during the war, and worked in Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, and have now retired and come back. They intended to come back. So that's a common thread, I think, that runs through the story and through life here. This is the first paragraph of the novel, River of Earth. And although I have forgotten writing a good bit of this, I do remember the day and the place and the occasion that I wrote this first section of this book. The mine's own little car closed in March. Winter had been mild, the snow scant and frost thin upon the ground. Robins stayed the season through, and sapsuckers came early to drill the black birch beside our house. Though Father had worked in the mines, we did not live in the camps. He owned the scrap of land our house stood upon, a garden patch, and the black birch that was the only tree on all the barren slopes above Blackjack. There were 3 of us children running barefoot over the puncheon floors, and since the year's beginning, Mother carried a 4th balanced on her hip as she worked over the rusty stove in the shed room. There were 8 in the family to cook for. 2 of Father's cousins, Harl and Tib Logan, came with the closing of the mines and did not go away.
Well, the metaphor of the river of earth is the absolute center of Still's writings, I think. And that metaphor is developed in a snippet of a sermon in the novel River of Earth, as it is perceived by the little boy narrator. Now you'll hear the little boy from this point on. The preacher raised a finger. He plunged it into his Bible, his eyes roving the benches. When the text was spread before him on the printed page, he looked to see what the Lord had chosen. He began to read. I knew then where his mouth was from the beard growth. That is, until he read, he couldn't even tell where this man's mouth was. And that's the way the little boy puts it. And so he read, the sea saw it and fled. Jordan was driven back. The mountains skipped like rams, and the little hills like lambs. Tremble, thou earth. And that's from one of the Psalms. That's his text. That's what he put his finger on, you see. He snapped the book to. He leaned over the pulpit. He said, I was born in a ridge pocket. I never seen the sunball without an heist in my chin. My eyes were set upon the hills from the beginning. Till I come on the word in this good book, I used to think a mouth was a standing God.
But here it says they go hopping and a skipping like sheep, a rising and a falling. All these hills ain't nothing but dirt waves washing down through eternity. And they in a valley so low, but what it'll rise again. And they in a mountain standing so proud it won't be brought down to the low ground of sorrow. Ah, my children, where are we going on this mighty river of earth? A born and a begetting and a dying, the living and the dead, riding the waters. Wherever it's sweeping his children, come to the river of life.
Part of the art of this is that James Still didn't perpetrate upon us the whole sermon. The little boy's mind wanders at this point, to something else, and that's all you get. And that's part of that minimalism, that I'm talking about.
Well, River of Earth was a book of real style, real writing style. I suppose I was the first one. I wrote many articles about James Still and taught him for a number of years, taught his books, and I always called him the Flaubert of Southern writing because he has the same quality that Flaubert has, which is the detail, which is the choice, which is bringing characters alive with a minimum of description. And then it was also a picture of Appalachia in a difficult time. The mines are closed. But you don't feel depressed when you read it, because this is seen from the standpoint of a little boy. And he doesn't know that he's living a difficult life. And I think this is an important insight, and it's been missed by a lot of people, I think.
River of Earth describes a nice little circle. At the beginning of the book, you have the family very close together, and the mother nursing this baby that she's just recently had. Through the course of the book, that baby dies. And by the end of the book, we have another death in the grandmother. The grandmother dies, and then at the end of the book, there's another birth. So the very last line of the novel has to do with death and birth. So the themes of Still's novels and stories, would just be the pattern of life or the passage of life more than anything.
That ebb and flow that is throughout River of Earth really spoke to me. I mean, it spoke to me like, the books I grew up with learning to read. Dick and Jane went down to the fire station and I observed them draining the fire hydrant. Hell, we never had any fire hydrants in High Hat, Kentucky. I didn't know what they were talking about. If they said they went down to the tipple and watch them unload coal and so forth, that made a lot more sense to me, So here was something speaking to me about my experience, and I remember that.
But for a long time, we were taught that our language is backward. It's, a thing of the past. It's not a way to speak. And when you went to school, you were supposed to be cured of the way you spoke. So I think the way he had of not doctoring the language up, but putting it in a way that people understand is a real gift of his.
That is absolutely something that's indescribable. It makes you feel relevant for the first time because your literature that associates with your life and stuff, just tells who you are. And if there is no literature about who you are, then you trying to find where you fit. River of Earth helps place me where I fit, you know.
I was really writing about people. And people are pretty much the same everywhere when it comes right down to it, except they were in a different kind of setting here than usual.
Something happened in the late 20s and 1930s, and then it was the first native voices from the Appalachian South. People who were born in that kind of life and knew it from the inside, outside. And Harriet Arno was one of them. James Still was another. Jesse Stewart was another. This is a significant change. And the works of those people are, for that reason, high on the list of works to be read by as part of the canon of Appalachian literature, which is just a branch of Southern literature, and Southern literature is in effect a branch of American literature. There's no contradiction between saying Appalachian literature and American literature. One just sits inside the other.
And that's the test of any kind of literature, that it's interesting not just to a specific group of people, but it's interesting to people anywhere. And James Still's work certainly has that kind of resonance. It's as valid in eastern Kentucky as it is in Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, anything like that.
I was trying to avoid what we call local color writing.
It's not local color at all. It's local. It's always concrete and specific. But then from that, everything's local somewhere, has to be. But from there, it's universal. You'll find the same sort of themes, the same kinds of ways that human beings have to grapple with the human condition. You'll find it anywhere on the globe.
The first winter I was here, we had a blizzard. And I just froze in this house. I pulled my bed over as close as I could get it to the fire. I heated rocks and had them wrapped up in towels and at the foot and sewn. And I knew that there were others in this area who were not as well housed as I was. And I wondered how they made it. But come spring, there they were. No complaint. And I wondered. And I call this one spring. Not all of us were warm, not all of us. We are winter lean. Our faces are sharp with cold, and there's a smell of wood smoke in our clothes. Not all of us were warm, though we hugged the fire through the long, chilled nights. We have come out into the sun again. We have untied our knot of flesh. We are no thinner than a hound or mare or an unleaved poplar. We have come through to the grass, to the cows calving in the lot.
I think it's real important to understand about James Still that he is not really in isolation from the world that he has written about. And he's really very much a part of the world that he is depicting and always has been. And of course that world has been translated into art.
How it was in that place, how light hung in a bright pool of air like water. In an eddy of cloud and sky, I will long remember. I will long recall the maple's blossoming wings, the oaks proud with rule, the spiders deep in silk, the squirrels fat on mast, the fields and draws and coves where quail and peewees call. Earth, loved more than any earth, stand firm, hold fast. Trees burdened with leaf and bird, root deep, grow tall. One thing that that jumps out at me in terms of the extreme up to the minuteness of Mr. Still's poetry is its environmental wholeness. He identifies with the leaf and the minnow and the fox, and it's a live world, not a human mental abstraction, but he's one among the living creatures of the world.
I moved here in the summer of 1939. It was a very dry summer, as it turned out. And Dead Mare Branch, which runs on one side of my place here, dried up to a series of pools, which were filled with minnows. And I drew water every day from my well to replenish the pools and try to keep them alive until a rain could come, without much success. But out of that came this poem, Leap, Minnows Leap. The minnows leap in drying pools, in islands of water along the creek bed sands they spring on drying tails, white bellies to the sun, gills spread, gills fevered and gasping. The creek is sun and sand and fish throats rasping. One pool has a peck of minnows. One living pool is knuckle deep with dying, a shrinking yard of glittering bellies. 1,000 eyes look, look. 1,000 gills strain, strain the water air. There is plenty of water above the dam, locked and deep, plenty, plenty and held. It is not here. It is not where the minnows spring with lidless fear. They die as men die. Leap, minnows, leap.
That everything comes into it. Everything, all the other little concerns and themes feed in just like little feeder streams into the river of earth. And this is not means. It doesn't mean that it's sad or it's unalleviatedly tragic, because there's a lot of humor, wonderful humor in James Still. That's part of the river of earth too.
Well, his alter ego really is Godey Spurlock. That's the one if he wants to do something that's mischievous, he lets Godey do it. Godey would do about anything. And so over the years, Mr. Steele has used Godey as sort of as a pen name.
When we were in Europe that summer of '86, we would write these kinds of reports, that people from small towns, when they go far away, they write back and tell people what they're experiencing. And Steele and I compose letters like that and send them back here to the Heinemann newspaper and sign them Godey Spurlock.
Saarbrücken, Germany, Friday, August 15th, 1986. I came over here to France, Belgium, and Germany with two fellows from Kentucky, James Steele from Knott County and Jim Wayne Miller from Bowling Green. Come with us, they said. I should have known better. When three people travel together, it's always trouble. Two gangs up and leaves the other one out in the lonesome. That's what James Steele and Jim Wayne Miller have done to me. Their eyes are set on museums and World War I and World War II battlefields. They're forever talking about things that happened way back yonder 1,000 years ago and more. Well, who cares about that? They do. In Trier, Germany, they got all excited because that's where Karl Marx was born, the one that started this communist business. Well, who cares? This Marx never did anything but cause trouble, and besides, he's been dead now for 100 years. But Steele and Miller takes up their time with what's done and over with and wasn't worth much in the first place. I just played my way through. I have to know where I'm going, of course. Otherwise, you don't have a story. I know the end before I know the beginning. And with a short story, the place to begin is as near the end as possible. And in all my little plots as such, or ideas, came right out of the ground, so to speak. There's something I knew about, heard about over there, which I built on. All of them. I would just sort of write the first paragraph, and then I'd write the last one. I was serious about the last one. And it might change. The idea wouldn't change, though. Now, I didn't know how I was going to get there, and I just aimed toward it. And I didn't know what was going to happen in between, except some vague idea. I was telling a story and making it as I went. I knew at some point I would wake up in the night and couldn't wait till the next morning. I get very excited. I'm sure my blood pressure would rise a little bit. I know it would. I used to get excited when I get into a piece of story, and I even think I'm breathing hard.
And yet, he says that he's always written more than he ever expected to. And I think that's a good way to go. There's no need to set yourself some kind of goal. You know, I'm going to write this much. You don't write like that. You write when something seems to need to be written, and that's the way he's done it. And he's kept himself, as he said, intact. He's not written anything for somebody else. He's always written it because he wanted to write it. And that's the genuine kind of writer.
But there was just one story that I wrote in which I got really too involved, and that was The Nest. I would never have thought to write that one, except that something of that sort happened. We had a student in the high school, a senior, who married a young widow with a child and dropped out of school. And we heard that in the winter, they sent her around to her grandparents, who lived just around the mountain there a little bit, while they went somewhere else. And this child was got to playing and got lost. And she spent 2 nights in sub-zero weather. Anyway, I got to thinking about it, and it got to bothering me. Nessie Hargis rested on a clump of broom sage and rubbed her numb hands. Her cheeks smarted, and her feet had become a burden. Wind flowed with the sound of water through trees high on the ridge, and the sun appeared caught in the leafless branches. Cow paths wound the slope, a puzzle of trails going nowhere. She thought, if ever I could see a smoke or hear an axe ring, I'd know the way.
We read so many stories today about abused children or children who have had a hard time, and we are told that they have a hard time, but James Still shows us. And there's a great difference between telling and showing.
I remember sort of planning for it. It would be a story with one character, one person, 6 years old, a little girl. There would be other people in it, but they were, flashbacks. It would have to be in words of one syllable as possible. And then I wrote it, and I got the child down toward the end to the fence, if you read it, and I got emotional about it, and I couldn't go on. And I didn't. 3 weeks later, I went back and wrote the last paragraph or two.
She felt no pain, only languor and thirst. The gap was 3 panels distant, and she hobbled toward it. She fell. Lying on the ground, she crammed snow into her mouth. Then she arose and passed under the bars, hardly needing to tilt her head. Nessie came down the slope. She lost a shoe and walked hippity-hop, one shoe on, one shoe off. The pasture was as feathery as a pillow. A bush plucked her bonnet, snatching it away. The bush wore the bonnet on a limb. Nessie laughed. She was laughing when the cows climbed by, heads wreathed in a fog of breath. and when a foxhorn blew afar, her drowsiness increased. It grew until it could no longer be borne. She parted a clump of broom sage and crept inside. She clasped her knees, rounding the grass with her body. It was like a rabbit's bed. It was a nest.
You know, I think it's writing of a high caliber, and I think the stories, particularly, you know, people generally concentrate more on novels, but I think his stories are right up there with the novel, and is, to me, pretty much his prime writing.
I never expected to be in a Saturday Evening Post and didn't particularly want to be. I thought if you were there, you were sold out. But one day I had this story, Bet Flight, and I had read an article in Time about the Saturday Evening Post. And I sent it to them. And back came a letter from the editor. And it said he would give me $500 for this story if I would change the last paragraph. One sentence. But that was a key sentence to the whole story. And my father said, Papa said, well, they mean $50, don't they? I said, no, they mean $500. Oh, you going to change? No, I'm not. And I didn't. But they took it anyway, and so I gave them my first Enterprise story in many a year.
I don't think the word humble is the word to describe Mr. Steele, but he's not arrogant. He's accepting of the honors, and he's appreciative of the honors, but they are not the end all to him.
Doing it is only fun there is out of it, feeling that I've accomplished something that I didn't think I could.
Do you know he's got seven honorary doctorates now, I think, you know, and he's won all these awards. But it's confirmation more than anything to him that all of this, of what he's done with his life, has been worth it. He wasn't one to promote himself. And other folks were getting a lot of press, a lot of attention, who had not written anything close to what he had written. And I believe that he was a little sad about that at times.
First thing that was done of his commercially was Hounds on the Mountain. That was done in the late 30s. River of Earth was 1940, I think, and then on Troublesome Creek, 1941. So after that, there was hardly anything published as far as a book is concerned until I did Pattern in '76, except for children's books. And so he was mainly known as a children's book author.
Jonathan Green, with this very small press, recognized that Mr. Steele had some needed to be published more, and he brought out this book of short stories. That book then established his again his literary reputation.
It seems to me that the increased interest in regional writing, which happened in the 70s, is part of a burgeoning consciousness of diversity that's part of the same spirit that produced the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. Suddenly, people are making it known that they don't have the same opinions, that they're different, that there's more than one version to this story. I think Jonathan Green publishing Pattern of a Man was a part of that consciousness, valuing what had been there all along, but taking another look and saying, this is important, this is something we need to have and distribute widely.
I think since the Wolf Pen poems came out, and since he himself has been an artist in the schools, and there's been, he's gotten more attention in the last 10 or 15 years. So I think people do recognize his stature maybe more than he even knows.
Gay boy has 3 tall, strapping sons standing 6'5" in wide, bare feet, and with handsome faces where laughter's never fading, and with swift fingers for silver strings twanging. The tallest picks the banjo, the thickest saws the fiddle, the broadest plays the dulcimer with the readiest grace, and the 3 together set the darkling hollow ringing, while the harmony goes tripping over moon-dappled hills.
This is a great opportunity for what he does and who he is to have his turn. You know, Jesse Stewart sort of had his go of it, you know, and he was associated with mountains and mountain riding. He was the dean of it for a long time, and they went to school together, you know. That's pretty remarkable. They both went to LMU at the same time. I might be projecting too much, but I kind of think he thinks that it's his turn now. And his work does deserve to be heard. Because he kind of holds back a little bit, people thought he was a hermit. So I think he's out to prove something with performing, you know, that he's not that image that people have of him.
Way back yonder, anything was written about me was, they'd mentioned my being a hermit. And I think hermits, they're sick, they're in trouble. Well, I don't have that. I'm not a hermit.
I think the image of James Still as a hermit or as an artist who has gone off to live in the woods like Thoreau or somebody is a very romantic notion. And it's a very nice image, but I don't think it's necessarily the way things are. But he's a private person, certainly, but he's not a hermit. He's an artist dedicated to what he's doing.
He's a man who is able to find words for what he sees and to put what he thinks into simple words. But he's a man who doesn't tell you everything and doesn't want people to know everything. And he's a man who's wonderfully friendly and warm, but he's a man who keeps his own distance and keeps his own counsel. And he's a man who's traveled around the world, and he's a man who's lived in one place for almost all of his life. He's a man of, I wouldn't say contradictions, that's too strong, but he's many-faceted and a little mysterious.
There's a tenderness in this man, and yet he's somewhat shy and retiring. And oftentimes people meet him, and they'll come away with the impression that he's gruff. But that's just his way of, you know, keeping back from people.
He just marches to the beat of a different drum. And you either march with him or he keeps on going. That's
Well, I'm very much aware that I'm now isolated, and that everybody who lived in this town, when I came here in '31, are all passed on. Every living soul, and these are new people, and I haven't got to know them very well. I haven't made a point of it. One of the things, I've been going places and moving around. I've been busy. I've been doing things, traveling. Spent 14 winters in Central America, interested in Mayan civilization. And I've been to France twice to visit battlefields, one and the other, you know, from Flanders all the way down to Verdun. And then I used to have the way I had to climb everything. I climbed all the great pyramids down here in Central America. I climbed the Great Pyramid Cheops in Egypt once. I even climbed the Leaning Tower of Pisa to the 3rd balcony and chickened out. It was, I couldn't go any farther. It just wasn't safe.
One little boy in the novel says he wants to go to the scrag end of the earth. And when I started traveling around with James Still, I knew where that came from, because exactly that's what he wants to do. He wants to go to the scrag end of the earth. He wants to find out everything.
And I don't just think of myself as just a Kentuckian or just an American. I like to think about myself as a world citizen. And what happens in Afghanistan eventually happens to me. influences me one way or another than everybody else. So I want to know what's going on, and they've tried to keep up all these years.
He's not as much of a hermit as we like to think, except in his writing. He's stuck right to this place in his writing.
I wish I was a swallow and had wings and could fly. This night to my true love I would draw nigh, and in her long dark arms all night I would lay, and watch those little windows till the breaking of day.
I shall not leave these pleasing hills, though they topple their barren heads to level earth, and the forests slide uprooted out of the sky. Though the waters of Troublesome, of Trace Fork, of Sand Lake rise in a single body to glean the valleys, to drown lush pennyroyal, to unravel rail fences. Though the sunball breaks the ridges into dust and burns his strength into the blistered rock, I cannot leave. I cannot go away. Being of these hills, being one with the fox stealing into the shadows, one with the newborn foal, the lumbering ox drawing green beech logs to mill, one with the destined feet of man climbing and descending, and one with death rising to bloom again, I cannot go. Being of these hills, I cannot pass beyond.